Well, welcome everyone to tonight's discussion. My name is Paul Brown and I'm chair of Cambridge for Europe, and I'd like to just welcome you to tonight's event, and I hope you find it very interesting. I think we've all been, in the UK at least, paying a lot of attention to the EU in recent years, but really for the last 5 years, the discussion here has been very much focused on Brexit, and perhaps understandably. But I think this same period has also seen an increasing confrontation between some individual member states, and especially Hungary and Poland in particular, and the rest of the EU on issues such as human rights, liberal values, and in particular the rule of law. And I think it's probably fair to say that these issues actually pose a far greater challenge to the EU than Brexit itself. And the questions that they raise about for the EU really have a really fundamental influence on really the future direction of the Union as a whole. Of course, the past couple of weeks have been very interesting. We've seen some very important developments, the election of Joe Biden being the one that I think we've all seen on the news, but also there have been very large scale protests in Poland, and an agreement in the EU to link EU funding to respect for the rule of law. And these other issues, I think, are going to have and how they're resolved and how they play out over the next few weeks are going to have a very large impact on how the rule of law crisis develops in the coming years. Our speakers this evening are extremely well informed on situations in Hungary and Poland respectively, and are going to share their perspectives about where we are now and how things might develop in the coming months and years. Márta Pardavi is the co-chair of the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, which is a leading human rights NGO in Budapest, and is also currently a policy leader fellow at the European University Institute School of Transnational Governance, which is based in Italy. Stanley Bill is a senior lecturer in Polish studies at the University of Cambridge and also founding editor of the Notes from Poland's news and analysis website. So I'd like to welcome both of them to our event today. I think they'll have to imagine your applause here, unfortunately, with the limitations of Zoom. Before I hand over to our speakers, I'll just go through some of the rules about how we're going to work this event today. So you've all been muted when you joined. We can unmute you if you need to ask a question later. When you joined, your video was turned off to preserve bandwidth, and we suggest you keep it off because there's quite a lot of people joining tonight's event. If you'd like to ask a question, you can submit it using the chat function at the bottom bar of Zoom. When you ask a question, you can specify if you'd like it to be read out by Kahir or Michael, who are helping us here tonight, or you'd like to actually be unmuted so you can ask it in person. We are going to record this talk as well and make it available later on our YouTube channel. So Stanley and Márta will initially speak for about 10 minutes each, after which we'll open the floor up for questions. I think without further ado, I'd like you to give a very warm welcome to Márta.
Thank you very much. And also a warm welcome from my side to everybody. I see that there's a lot of people here, and it's always hard to talk to an audience that you cannot even see. And I also am not aware of the level of detail that you have about either Poland or Hungary or both. But I do see from the names that there's a lot of Hungarians and Poles here, so it's great that you decided to join on this Thursday evening, and I hope I'll be able to give you a little bit of news, although I presume that you follow developments in your countries very closely. Today, we're again, of course, in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, and I thought I'd give you a little bit of background on what is going on in Hungary today on this issue and how it relates to rule of law developments and human rights developments. As we sit here, everybody is facing uncertainty, a lot of worry, and there's a lot of challenges related to the pandemic. And this is, of course, also sadly true for Hungary, where there is over 6,400 people in hospitals today, over 4,000 people are found to be infected in terms of new infections, and over 15% of the tests that are performed are positive. It is a healthcare situation that is close to spiraling out of control, and hopefully both the government and everybody in Hungary is doing their best to keep it within controllable bounds. But at the same time, these worries also impact not only healthcare and people's health, but also the economy. And there is a forecast of a 6 to 7% shrinkage in the economy in 2020, 7 to 9% budget deficit is forecast. This sounds like a pretty disastrous impact for Hungary. In terms of unemployment, there is growing unemployment. Hungary has been experiencing in the past few years a very low level of unemployment, but this is now growing. About 4.7% of the population seems to be unemployed, and about 1/3 of these people have been unemployed for long term. A lot of people are worried about losing their jobs and incomes, particularly if they work in the service sector and in tourism. And in general, of course, people also always have concerns. A recent study by the National Democratic Institute, a US-based organization, found that in Hungary, for young people who are in the age bracket of 16 to 29, the top 3 concerns are healthcare, rising prices, and corruption. And the following 3 are unemployment, climate change, and education. And altogether, many Hungarians who look at Mr. Orbán's government's performance in the past 10 years since he's been continuously prime minister since 2010 also share these concerns. When people are asked what have been the most popular measures of the Hungarian government, people in a large majority answer that the family policies, which means more financial support to families, have been the most successful, the most popular, and also the anti-migration measures, which for which Hungary has become quite infamous. And also another measure that left more money in people's pockets, utility cost reductions. But when they ask about what are the top failures of government policy, they name healthcare. And this comes out as one of the top 3 for about 57% of the population. And 1/4 of people, every 4th person in Hungary says that this is the #1 issue that they're concerned about. This is where the government is failing. The second is second failure on a lack of success is what social inequalities, growing inequality. And the third is the vulnerability of employees. People don't feel safe in their jobs. And so it is against this background, and these numbers, the latter numbers I've mentioned were coming from a study that a Hungarian think tank did in April, so before the pandemic really hit Hungary. These numbers are worsened by the pandemic. And it is against this background that we have to look at the latest developments of rule of law in Hungary. Just this week, a number of sweeping changes have been proposed by the government, which are now pending before the Hungarian parliament. And these measures are causing quite a lot of outrage among concerned Hungarians, concerned for equality, for human dignity, and also for the rule of law in Hungary. Now, you must have heard quite a lot in the past 10 years about how the Hungarian government has become world famous for taking Hungary down a very steep decline on its democratic indicators. Sadly, Hungary has built up a reputation of becoming the only authoritarian state in the European Union. This is how the VDEM Institute, a very prestigious scientific think tank in that looks at democracy, it's a Swedish organization, has termed Hungary, it's an electoral autocracy. This is what VDEM has found. Now, this is quite well documented and well known. It has led to the European Parliament actually triggering the so-called Article 7 procedure against the Hungarian government. But this did not stop the Hungarian government from going on forward with further attempts at power grabs that further weaken checks and balances and independent democratic institutions in Hungary. This week, the bills that the government has introduced are, and maybe we can talk about the details later, but they target the idea of political pluralism in Hungary, making it more, or proposing rules that would make it far more difficult for opposition parties to have a chance at forging alliances in the election campaign coming up in 2021, before general elections are held in April, probably, of 2022. Another avenue of the changes proposed make it more difficult for public funds to be traceable when they are when they make their way into private pockets. So Hungary has had a corruption problem for many, many years. Transparency International and others describe this as reverse state capture. And this will just be worsened by the proposed measures, which would make it even more difficult to trace how public funds are given to maybe private trusts that are set up, or even private entities. A third avenue, which, and people who follow Poland will know this quite well, is an increased targeting of not only migrants as minorities, but also the LGBTIQ community in Hungary. This was not something that was on the Hungarian political agenda for many years, but after an initial narrative campaign, it seems that the Hungarian government has decided to take legislative steps to curb the rights and basically the equality of LGBTIQ people and also couples, making it very clear that the constitutionally protected values would not and rights would not really extend to people who are in a same-sex relationship or who have different value sets than what the Hungarian government currently possesses. This move towards a very aggressive, intolerant attitude, however, does not seem to be met at the moment by the popular sentiment. And contrary to how the Hungarian population perceives migrants and refugees at the moment, it seems that this is an avenue that the government wants to fuel, a sentiment, a negative sentiment that it wants to fuel to probably create public debates, polarize society further, to perhaps divert attention from the growing inequalities and its failure to really address the pandemic healthcare wise and both also on the economy side in an effective manner. Now, this was my very short introduction, and I look forward to hearing your questions, trying to answer them, and also your comments. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Márta. I think we'll move on to Stanley next, and then we'll have questions and after that. Great.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much, Márta, for getting us started. So you may well have heard that today the news has broken that Poland has officially threatened to veto the EU budget if it is linked to rule of law conditionality in any way. That letter was sent today by the Polish Prime Minister to the head of the Commission, the President of the European Council, and the German Chancellor. So according to these reports, Poland will not agree to such a mechanism, though obviously this is part of an ongoing negotiation and nobody really knows what's going to happen next. I think what I want to lay out very briefly First of all, what the Polish ruling party, Peace, Law and Justice, has done in the area of rule of law. And secondly, how the EU has responded so far, and to what degree has that been effective. So I think it's important to note to begin with that to an extent, Poland has actually been following a kind of Hungarian playbook very, very intentionally. Kaczynski has emulated Orban. The big difference is that since winning power in 2015, PiS's parliamentary majorities have been relatively small, nowhere near the constitutional majority that Orban has had. And that means that PiS has used a raft of ad hoc measures through ordinary legislation to erode Poland's constitutional order and the independence of the judiciary. These measures have been described as such and have been strongly criticized really by a whole range of external institutions. And this is from the Venice Commission and the European Commission, even across to conservative American think tanks like the Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation. So really there are very few independent observers who are prepared to defend these reforms. So why is PiS introducing them? What are their arguments? Well, Jarosław Kaczyński's argument since 1989 has effectively been that Poland's transition from communism was not completed, and that post-communist elites were unfairly able to retain power in the economy and in various state institutions, including the judiciary. And therefore, he has argued that there's a need for almost a new state, a kind of revolution that would involve replacement of elites in all institutions. With respect to the judiciary, PiS has argued that many judges have a background in the communist times, first of all, so there's a question of historical justice that they raise. And secondly, that the courts are inefficient and corrupt in various ways. With respect to inefficiency, there's some truth to that claim, and many Poles support some kind of reform of the judiciary, but PiS's changes have been much more radical right across the board and are not in the same way supported by the same number of Poles. Now, if we look at the changes that PiS has made, it's crucial to look at them as a whole system of interlocking simultaneous changes. Certain individual changes are arguably legitimate in some dimensions. That's a point that the Venice Commission has made, for example. But the effect of all of these changes together is clearly, as the Commission argues, inflicting damage on judicial independence in the country. First of all, PiS took over effectively the Constitutional Court. Now, this process began at the end of 2015. It was seen as a key move that would be necessary to ensure that any future moves would not be stymied. So when they came to power, PiS appointed 5 new judges to the court instead of the 2 to which they were entitled at the time. And they illegally installed a close personal associate of Jarosław Kaczyński as the court president. Since then, they have legally, in fact, appointed multiple party loyalists to the court, and Kaczyński is reportedly steering the timing, at least, of the court's business through his connection with the court president. And this was part of what happened recently in the abortion ruling that led to the mass protests in Poland. Secondly, PiS reunited the offices of the Prosecutor General and the Justice Minister in the person of Zbigniew Ziobro, giving him also more control over the prosecutorial service. This is not often mentioned, but it's a very important part of these changes, which together with the changes in the judiciary creates a justice system that is potentially politicized on both sides. Thirdly, the party purged a large number of court presidents and vice presidents right across the country in the common courts, replacing them with the justice minister's candidates and giving them increased powers. The fourth thing they did was to change the method of appointment to the National Council of the Judiciary, which is the body charged with protecting, ironically, the independence of courts and judges. This body nominates judges. The new method of appointment to this body increases massively the influence of the parliament and thus the ruling party on the appointments to this council. The terms of the former members were cut short and this newly politicized council was installed. And finally, in the Supreme Court, the ruling party introduced legislation initially to arbitrarily lower the retirement age for judges, thus removing a whole group of them, while also expanding the court and adding powerful new chambers that would be filled with new appointees of their own newly politicized National Council of the Judiciary. So you can see how these changes are interlocked. One of these chambers is a disciplinary chamber with powers to discipline judges, for instance, those resisting the government's attacks on judicial independence. The other is a so-called extraordinary chamber, which has powers, among others, to rule on the validity of elections. So what you can see, the result of all this activity is a very significantly increased politicization of the judicial and justice system at all levels: the Constitutional Court, the Supreme Court, the Common Courts, the Judiciary Council, and the Prosecutorial Service. So what this means is there is potentially the possibility for political interference in the processes of justice in Poland. Now, what the results of that have actually been so far is less clear. So we're talking more about potential than actual cases, though there are some, but that's mostly what the Venice Commission, the European Commission, and others are talking about. So how has the EU responded? Well, Marta's already referred to the Article 7 process, which is for persistent breaches of the EU's founding values, including rule of law, and is a procedure that can eventually, in theory, lead to the suspension of voting rights in the Council of the European Union. Of course, this has never happened. In Poland's case, the procedure was triggered by the Commission in 2017, but since then, very little progress has been made. So to some extent, this seems to be a dead article because unanimity in the Council is required to impose the sanctions. Apart from Hungary, which clearly would be expected to veto such a move against Poland, for instance, other European countries are supposedly reluctant to take such a significant step. Apart from the Article 7 procedure, the Commission has also launched multiple infringement procedures concerning specific laws, among those that I've talked about, passed by the Polish government regarding the judiciary. Several of these have then led to interim rulings by the European Court of Justice, and eventually to rulings that Poland's new laws have in fact breached European law. And some of these rulings have forced the Polish government to back down. So for instance, in the case of this arbitrary lowering of the retirement age for Supreme Court judges, that was adjudged to be in breach of European law, and Poland backed down, and those judges were in fact reinstated after having been previously retired. So we can see, therefore, that in fact, the European Court of Justice has so far been the most effective line of defense from European institutions against what's happening in Poland. And to some extent, you can see European institutions learning from the complete lack of efficacy in their action against Hungary in the Polish case. So there has been a more determined set of actions brought against Poland. Also important to note that individual European countries, including the Netherlands, Norway, and Ireland, have begun to treat Polish courts as illegitimate, which is really quite a dangerous development, in fact. So, for instance, refusing to extradite suspects to Poland, just ordinary criminal suspects, on the basis that they cannot be guaranteed a fair trial in a country where the court's independence has been eroded. So the final measure that is in the news right now is the idea, the new idea, relatively new idea of rule of law conditionality for the EU budget. So the idea that the dispensation of European funds would depend on respect for rule of law in member states. Now, decisions on this, according to the proposal that is going forward right now, would be taken on proposals of the European Commission by the Council of the European Union by a qualified majority. And in order to launch this kind of procedure, there are two conditions that would have to be met. They would have to show that there are breaches of the principle of the rule of law, and secondly, that these principles could affect the actual management of the EU budget. So that's where we are right now. And as I said, literally about 3 hours ago, the news broke that the Polish Prime Minister had sent a letter to the head of the European Commission, of the European Council, and to the German Chancellor, saying that Poland would be prepared to veto the entire European budget, including the COVID money, if this rule of law conditionality were to be attached to it. Is this a hollow threat? Is this part of a negotiating process? These are open questions, and we'll see how this situation continues to develop over the coming days and weeks.
Great, thank you, Stanley. Excuse me. I think we can move on to questions now. That was a great introduction. I think there'll be quite a few of them coming in. Michael, are you looking after questions at the moment? Great.
Yes, Paul, I am. Yes, thanks. Happy to take over from there. We've got a question from Karen Culver. I think Karen probably wants to ask it herself, so I'm just going to unmute her. So Karen, you should be able to unmute yourself. Okay, I'm not sure if that's working, so maybe I'll just go to asking Karen's question. So Karen was, I think, picking up on some of Stanley's, the end of what Stanley was saying there, saying that the EU seemed toothless. What specific and ongoing action should they take against member countries to maintain or increase the rule of law?
I mean, Márta might have some more specific ideas than I would just give a very brief answer, and then perhaps Márta might want to jump in. But I mean, I don't have any sort of prescriptions to give. As I said, if we simply look at what has worked so far, the European Court of Justice has been clearly the most effective institution that's actually forced the Polish government to back down. It seems to me that the budgetary idea has potential, but on the other hand, it had been watered down significantly from some of the original ideas that were proposed, and it does depend on breaches of the principle of rule of law that would have a specific effect on the financial management of the European budget. Now, there are also, the European Commission has launched what will be regular now reports on rule of law in the European member states to monitor developments in those member states. And I think we can put that together with these budgetary measures, that it's the idea that they're trying to show that this monitoring is not directed exclusively at Poland and Hungary, but that there's going to be monitoring across the EU. There are issues with rule of law in other EU states as well. It's not just Poland and Hungary. They're considerably more serious in Poland and Hungary. But is there a magic bullet to solve the problem? In the current institutional structure and with the kind of political will that there is, and this is the very important question, is there the political will from, for instance, from Germany to really come down on Poland, or particularly Hungary, with whom, you know, there are supposedly very important sort of interests of German manufacturers, for instance, in Hungary. Is the political will there? I don't know. So I'm afraid I don't have a very simple or easy answer to that question, but I agree that it's a very important one.
Márta, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, thank you. Hungary and Poland are usually mentioned alongside as the two troublemakers, but there are differences, and I'm sure everybody in this event attending this will know. Even the Article 7 procedure, which was triggered by the European Parliament, recognized that Hungary has a much wider set of problems that range basically through all the fundamental democracy issues, whereas generally the Polish scenario is described more in the rule of law and independence of the judiciary framework. Somebody else is asking, I can see here in the chat, about the link to media freedom. And this is one of the key issues where I think Poland is still safer or better off than Hungary, for example. Now, this rule of law monitoring report that Stanley also talked about finally recognized
do you want to watch the
that. So the rule of law monitoring report recognized that beyond the issues related to the justice system and the independence of courts and judges, there's also very crucial issues about media freedom, the safety of journalists, the ability of journalists to carry out their work, and also issues related to civil society. And these are just two other pillars of a well-functioning democracy that the rule of law report picked up on. A fourth topic was corruption. But there's plenty of other issues that one could talk about. And so far, the European Union's institutions in their attempts at responding to these phenomena that maybe no one really expected when when Hungary and Poland and the other then called new member states joined the EU, these answers that the institutions can come up with can never really get ahead of reality, of how fast reality is changing. And so this is, I think, why it's important to think of this whole rule of law problematics in a wider sense, in a more expanded framework. Particularly, the role of the media is key. And on this, the European Commission, for example, has not been extremely effective or rapid in its response when it was confronted by actual complaints from Hungary that focus on how state advertising is distorting the private media market, or that and this is also something that is happening in Poland, as far as I know, that the public broadcasters have been completely turned into government mouthpieces, which are not only towing the government's line, but actually they're spreading lies and disinformation. And so these are phenomena that the Commission is trying to address now, and it should really up its game, if I can say this. But in the meantime, things go ahead and markets are distorted and independent newspapers are disappearing and journalists are facing intimidation. And this is something that the Rule of Law Monitoring Report actually described. And one does wonder what will the Commission do with this information now that it has it as it on its own letterhead paper. And when it comes to civil society and civic activism, there's also, I think, a difference between Poland and Hungary. Sadly, when I looked at various other reports, indexes that look at democracy or civic space or freedom of the press, Hungary always comes out much worse than Poland. I know this is probably not comforting for people in Poland who are worried, but certainly it can get worse in a European Union space. And that is appalling, and it's also something that we as citizens have to address. And I think this is one of the big lessons that institutions themselves are always going to be slow to react, particularly when it comes to the European Union's institutions, but citizens can be faster. And I think the last few weeks in Poland have really shown how the women's strike can galvanize not only women, as far as I understood, but a lot of other people to make the government think twice on certain issues. Now, it's interesting how many of these divisive issues related to values or Christian values, as they're posited, have been just recently began to play out in Hungary, but the abortion issue has not. I don't know what is the actual reason behind the Hungarian government holding back on this topic, but they do carry out very well-funded opinion poll surveys. And I'm fairly convinced that the public opinion in Hungary is different on this issue, as on some other issues too, as compared to Poland. But certainly civil society, civic activism is one local factor that can and should be supported. So it's not really only the European institutions themselves, but we as citizens who also have to show that we care and that we care for our institutions. And this is just as a last thought, I think one grave difficulty is that public trust in these institutions is very often extremely low. And so if people don't trust their public institutions, you cannot expect them to stand up for them. It's much easier to dismantle them. And this public trust has to be both earned and built up.
Thank you, Márta. Thank you for that sort of rallying cry towards the need for civic action. Sarah Squire has asked what the role of the American alt-right, figures like Steve Bannon might be within European countries such as Hungary and Poland.
Very small. So, I mean, he's not a relevant figure. Occasionally, he's been interviewed a couple of times on state television, and he's in Poland, and he's certainly treated as an ally in the same way that Trump has been treated as an ideological ally. And Polish state media have been quite slow to accept Trump's recent election loss, in fact. But no, I don't think he's really relevant. And of course, you have to remember as well that to a significant extent, the developments in Poland and Hungary predated the rise of an American alt-right and certainly the rise of Trump. And there isn't really a question of influence there. And sometimes you actually do see the alt-right looking to countries like Poland and Hungary as a sort of example to them, in fact. There are a couple of interesting questions that I can see here. I wanted to comment on the national media, on the media question. I see Agnieszka Khan here says national media have been seized by the government. I would agree with Márta that the situation in Poland is not as bad as in Hungary. There are causes for concern. It's absolutely true, as Agnieszka points out, that the public media have been turned into the worst kind of propaganda outlet, to the extent that this really, anybody that would look at it for the first time would think that they were watching the public media of an authoritarian state without question. It's just the most primitive propaganda all day long for the government, attacking opponents, both political and non-political. But Poland's broader media landscape remains diverse, and it's probably fair to say that most of the big private media, or a good proportion at least of the big private media, are not friendly to peace. So that's the situation at the moment. The Polish government has been making noises for years about re-Polonizing the media market, or introducing legislation that would reduce the concentration of media ownership, both of which ideas would be aimed at critical media outlets, critical private media outlets. But for various reasons, they haven't done that. It's not easy to do because in terms of any foreign ownership law, companies that are owned by German companies, their European law would make that very difficult to restrict that ownership. There are other companies that are owned, a big private TV channel that's very critical of the government, but that's owned by Discovery, which is an American company. And so in that case, the importance of the American alliance gives a diplomatic reason why they can't really act on that. Concentration laws also have problems going attached to them, so deconcentration laws. So they still haven't done anything. They may, and we need to watch this carefully. And I think it's absolutely true that the European institutions, yet again, will have learnt from the Hungarian case and will be more keen to act if the Polish government makes moves in that direction. Although there are also laws that they could pass that nobody could do anything about, because they would be equivalent of laws that do exist in other places, certain kinds of deconcentration laws. There's another question which a couple of people have been interested in, which is what is the relationship like between Poland and Hungary? And it certainly is close, and they see themselves as allies. They, in their dialogue with each other, they emphasize quite a long-standing historical relationship over several centuries. Clearly, they see themselves as sharing common interests, sharing, the two governments at the moment, that is, sharing a common ideology. However, there are differences as well, and it's certainly not guaranteed that they're going to stick up for each other, and particularly that the Hungarians are going to stick up for the Poles in Europe. So one thing that is very different is their attitude towards Russia. So obviously the Polish government, it takes a very hawkish line on Russia and is against dialogue with Russia, really, and is certainly against lifting any sanctions on Russia, whereas the Hungarian government has been much much more positive about having relations, mostly economic relations, with Russia. And with respect to support from Hungary for Poland in any action that might be taken against Poland, everybody remembers this vote in 2017 when the Polish government really didn't want one of their arch enemies, Donald Tusk, to have his term as the president of the European Council extended. And in the end, the vote was 27-1 against Poland. The Hungarians fell in line, Hungary fell in line with the majority there. So where Orban didn't see it as being as in his interest to fight that fight, he left the polls. There's certainly the sense that they're not necessarily going to be aligned on every issue, but there's a very strong relationship and a sense of alignment on a good number of issues. The Women's March idea came up. I might leave that for now, but just signal that I'd be happy to talk about that because it's a very important development in Poland. If anybody has a question on that or wants to come back to that, I think it's very significant politically and culturally and socially in Poland, and something I'd be very interested to talk about if somebody wants to hear about that later.
Okay, thanks, Stanley. Márta, did you want to say anything in relation to that, the sort of original question there of American alt-right influence, and maybe also how the government in Hungary faces on to Russia in the opposite direction?
Yes, I can add a couple of thoughts on that, although I must say I'm not an expert on either of these topics. When it comes to Steve Bannon, of course, there was, I think, a sort of a period of a honeymoon with the Hungarian government, but I would not consider Steve Bannon as a really important influence at the moment, neither for Hungary or for European politics. But the American alt-right is far more important, and we see how the Hungarian government has been building up links, partnerships with alt-right movements in the US, not only in the US, but very much in the United States over the past couple of years. And this is very detectable, at least for me. But I must add, I'm not an expert, but at least it's striking that the rhetoric of Christian values, of very conservative family values, a focus on gender and all things gender related, how these have come to the forefront. There are various events where the Hungarian government is prominently attending, where these ideas are being discussed, and I do feel that this is certainly not organic in Hungary. It does not come from sort of a deep down popular sentiment. And this is related also to the role of the church or churches in Hungary. I think the population is far more secular than in Poland. And that's why many of these discussions around values and societal values have not really been present in Hungary. Very often surveys show that Hungarians really do pay attention to the money that they earn. This is something that mobilizes people. This is what gets people upset, but it's not really these values. Of course, with sufficient dominance in the media sphere, of course, a lot of people can be, persuaded to change their mind. This is something that is, I think, pretty visible on migration, how the Hungarian population has considerably become far more xenophobic than before 2015. There was tons of millions of euros, or even hundreds of millions of euros spent on this. Maybe this is something that if it's pragmatically convenient, the Hungarian government would want to spend money on, but at the moment it doesn't seem to be the case. That's on Russia. It's a very complicated relationship, but for example, something that is quite striking is how very often when it comes to discussions about disinformation and the spread of what are often called, fake news, people who follow this closely say that it's not Russian disinformation that is being spread in Hungary, but rather it's that is absolutely domestically produced for domestic consumption. So it's the Hungarian government through its own propaganda machinery, both public and also private, that takes care of this. On this issue, the Russian influence is indirect rather. Of course, politically, the alliances and the trade relations are probably stronger.
Great, thank you. I'll just ask one more question and then perhaps I can hand over to my colleague Kahir after this. So I just wanted to put a couple of comments together. A couple of people, Gosia and Florian, I think have both noted the kind of continued electoral success of Fidesz and PiS. And Florian's expressed the question as how and why did liberal democracy with all its personal freedoms and so on lose its attractiveness in Poland and Hungary? And how can this model become attractive again? Stanley, do you want to?
Well, it's a huge question. I mean, if you're talking about the popularity of PiS, I mean, first of all, it's important to note that we're talking about between 38 and 45% of the population that have been voting for PiS. You know, they had a sort of base support of somewhere around 25, 27% on some estimates. And then there's that additional group that swings in the middle. And so this is a country that, and those voters might be swinging for different reasons, right? So it's a country that is relatively conservative on many issues. It's a country that is in its demographic structure based in small towns and villages more than in large cities. And it's a country in which there's relative support for a kind of national ideology, a relative degree of support for that, and a relative degree of support also for the kind of relatively high degree of support for the kind of redistributive mechanisms that PiS has brought in, that Márta also referred to in Hungary, that are part of the popularity with one part of the electorate. So those measures and a very favorable external economic situation, I think, were a significant part of PiS's success. I mean, the previous government had been in power for 8 years. They'd run out of ideas. And I think there was this time that had come in Poland's transition where, I mean, this is something that Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes have written about, this idea of imitation. There are some problems with that argument, but it's got some value as well. This idea that the imitative phase of Poland's transition was sort of running out of gas. This idea that all we want to do is just join the West, follow the path that the other countries in the other part of Europe had already taken, and do all the things that they do economically, but also socially, politically, and culturally. And when the European Union is being hit by one crisis after another, that obviously reduces the sort of prestige of that outside Western model for a start. Secondly, Poland is growing, getting stronger, its economy is getting stronger. And I think there was this moment, therefore, of a greater kind of national assertiveness that we don't need to do everything the same way as everywhere else. And therefore, a party that was prepared to come and say, well, come out and say, no, we're different, we have different characteristics in our value. Our values are different. We share a lot of values, but we have some differences from the West. And those differences are often couched in terms of we're the real Europe. The West is sort of degenerating and moving away from its sort of Christian values, and we are the defenders of the real European values. That's how it's often presented. So I think that was, it was a time where that kind of ideology was ripe to be used successfully electorally. And then also there's a part of the electorate for whom the appeal was mostly these redistributive policies, which, it has to be said, and it should be emphasized, have been successful in some areas. So the child benefits policies, which have reduced inequality in Poland, and they've reduced inequality particularly in regions that felt ignored by the transition. And no region in Poland didn't benefit from the transition. Everybody did. That can be seen very clearly through all kinds of statistical measures. But it's true that the big cities benefited more, and people living in these regional areas, which, as I mentioned, are the majority of the Polish population, in many ways felt marginalized or felt ignored, and PiS was able to speak to those people and empower them in certain ways. And in fact, there's research that shows if you ask people the question, in surveys, do people like you have a say in the affairs of your country? The number of people in Poland that say yes in answer to that question has risen significantly. So there are people that feel they have more of a stake, that they're being listened to. So that, that was a successive piece, and the external economic circumstances were very conducive, because Poland's economy has been going extremely well, and that has allowed the government to introduce these mechanisms. It's a long way of saying that it's a very complicated question, and I'm not sure that we can say on the whole Poland has turned against the liberal democratic model, because there's still a significant proportion of Poles, maybe even the majority, that at least declaratively would say that they agree with all of the principles of liberal democracy. In practice, some of them wanted to give peace a go, and many of them think that the sorts of things I was talking about with the judiciary are abstract ideas that are really just battles between elites in Warsaw that don't concern us. They're all a bunch of bandits anyway, and at least peace is doing something for us. That kind of attitude would be the way some people would look at it. And, having lived in Poland for a long time, I know most people I know that had any contact with the judiciary didn't have very positive things to say about it, which of course may be true of anybody who has anything to do with the judiciary in any country, just by nature of what that involvement might be. But nevertheless, the sorts of stories I regularly heard were not good stories. So all of these things together means that peace grabbed that extra 6, 7, 8 percentage points of the electorate that they didn't have before, and that was the difference between them getting into power and being in opposition as they were previously. So there is a change in Poland, but it's not some kind of absolute swing. It's something that needs to be looked at in a kind of gradational way.
Okay, so there was a question, it's about Fidesz, but I guess it applies to some extent to Poland as well. So given the control over things like constituency boundaries, prosecutions for corruption, how do you see any way to proceed? So I think you've already talked about how the EU might proceed, but more general in terms of civil society, what way do you see to proceed?
Well, we'll see how, under these changed rules of the election procedure and electoral campaigns, the opposition political parties will be able to proceed. But certainly the surveys do point to quite a lot of dissatisfaction in Hungary. And these issues that people are unhappy about, that they're worried about, healthcare, jobs, their level of income, the losses that they're going to be facing, are issues that affect everybody. Even Fidesz voters are affected, and a lot of people, I think, will be very hard hit, particularly when it comes to healthcare today. You can't rest assured that you will, if you go to a hospital, come out in better shape, even though there's, doctors and nurses are doing their best, but the government has not really used all its abilities and the favorable economic conditions in the past 10 years to remedy a very long-standing problem. And now with the pandemic, this has become very, very obvious. And so these are, of course, also issues that require a space where people can discuss them and where there's information. And this is, I think, where civil society has the biggest role, to ensure that there would be, journalists who can continue to write about these issues, that there would be a media market which still allows independent or government critical outlets to operate, that there would be a full respect for people's right to protest, which is extremely difficult now in the pandemic when there is a full ban on assemblies, for example. And so this absolutely makes it harder. But on the long term, or maybe in a couple of months, I think these fault lines will become more evident. It's very telling that a lot of people, about 2/3 of Hungarians, think that the Orbán government favors the rich, and the majority is worse off after 10 years of them being in power. And this, of course, this 2/3 of the respondents to this survey that was done by a Hungarian think tank also encompass a lot of Fidesz voters. Even 55% of the pro-government voters agree that the country is worse off today than it was 10 years ago. And this survey was done in April, so before the pandemic hit. And people are upset over this. And if maybe these new changes to the electoral rules will also force opposition parties to come together. The electorate certainly, I think there's an expectation that they should join forces. So this might pose a significant enough challenge to Mr. Orbán's government, which will either be responded to by further shrinking of sort of the chance of dissent and opposition politics, or some sort of loss of supermajority in parliament. That already would be, I think, a sort of a better balanced power dynamic, would enable quite a lot of progress in Hungary. But progress has to be viewed in the fact of as either slowing down on this autocratization course, or maybe undoing a couple of things. But as all these indexes show, the damage is quite substantial. One cannot expect, just an election victory to solve these problems. I think on this, Poland is probably in much better shape.
Okay. Several people have made comments on church, and you've both speakers have kind of skirted around it a little bit. But maybe summing up several of the comments about both Poland and Hungary in different ways is maybe how warm do you think that relationship is between the ruling parties and religion stroke church in both countries?
Well, in Poland, it's been very close. The relationship between certain parts of the church, particularly the more conservative parts of the church, so famously the ultra-conservative Catholic media of Father Tadeusz Rydzyk, and this is a group that has supported peace. It supports it in its media outlets. There are places in Poland where priests give sort of semi-political speeches in their churches, and the general sort of ideological line that peace has introduced in its time in government, in many respects coheres with the church, with the church's line, and the representatives of the government appear with representatives of the church and with Father Rydzyk in particular. And it was very important very recently, for instance, in everything that led up to the abortion ruling and the protests that followed, because there are many interpretations of exactly why this ruling happened now. It's an interesting situation because it's actually where rule of law, the question of culture wars and civil society all sort of come together. So what essentially happened is that this was a ruling made by the theoretically independent constitutional court, but in practice, almost certainly the timing of the decision was dictated by Kaczynski, who controls the business of the court through his close relation with the court president. And so he, in fact, has been delaying this issue of abortion for years because he knows that the majority of Poles support the current legislation in Poland, the so-called abortion compromise, which is very restrictive by other European standards, but allows abortion in 3 particular instances. He knew that the majority of Poles support that and don't want to see the law further tightened. But on the other hand, he has these ultra-conservative allies who have supported him in election campaigns and whose ideas he uses in PiS's ideology that they present in these election campaigns and that they use to mobilize particularly the base, which has very conservative views. And of course, any election, getting the base out to vote is crucial to winning. And he knows that the church was important in mobilizing that base in various respects. And therefore, the time had come to pay them back. And that's in a way how we should understand why the abortion ruling happened now, because it's after the presidential elections, it's 3 years until the next parliamentary elections. So Kaczynski seems to have calculated that this was the right time to do it. He probably thought it would be more difficult for protests to happen because of the pandemic. But this is an instance where you have this very significant policy decision, in this case not being made politically, but being made by a court, but a court that's controlled politically, but is ultimately dictated by the needs of this relationship with at least some factions of the church and other conservatives who are not strictly speaking in the church themselves, but are Catholic in the way that they promote themselves and promote their ideology. So this is something that we have seen, this tightening of the relationship between the church and the state over PiS's time in power. But what's very interesting, and I think what the protests are perhaps a symptom of, is that this may actually end up having a negative effect on support for the church and on religious practice in Poland, and may accelerate the process of secularization, precisely because this combination of interests and this politicization of religion is something that a lot of religious people, a lot of Catholics actually find very distasteful. They don't want to see religion being done by politicians. They don't want to see their priests getting involved in politics. And therefore, it creates, or it could be creating something of a backlash against the church that is also being accelerated by a slew of the revelations of pedophile scandals within the church. That is all starting to happen in Poland now, obviously familiar from other countries. And there was a real wave of anti-church sentiment in a way, not just from radicals, but more broadly in Poland, that was being partly expressed through the protests that we saw out on the streets. So it's a very complicated set of relations, but the Catholic Church at this point in time remains strong, and at least some factions of the church are important allies for PiS, and PiS at various times has been very keen to support the church. Jarosław Kaczyński specifically has said, literally, outside of the church is only nihilism. There is no available moral code in Poland outside the church. Those are his words. So it's very much the idea that the church and Polishness are inextricably bound in the way that Polishness is presented by PiS.
So a bit related to that, jumping down to a more recent question is, do you think it's a good strategy for the women's strike, the women's movement, to shift to multiple agendas and attempt to reshape itself into an independent political movement, potentially a party? You're muted, Stanley.
Already mentioned the fact that the energy had gone out of the protests a bit. Obviously, Poland has seen much heavier restrictions due to COVID. Poland's seeing over 20,000 cases a day and several hundred deaths a day at the moment. So it's really, the wave is hitting Poland. So that has sort of slowed the protests down to some extent. Also, as Paul points out, the fact that PiS, I mean, ironically, has not published the ruling of its own captured constitutional court yet, which means that this ruling hasn't come into effect yet. So nothing has changed legally in Poland's abortion law yet. So the question of how can this, what is the meaning of this extraordinary outpouring on the streets of Poland? Does it have long-term meaning? As I said at the beginning, PiS has dropped in the polls to essentially its lowest levels recently since 2015. Some of that is absolutely on the back of the abortion ruling and the protests. Some of it's about the handling of COVID. But is this just a flash in the pan? I mean, is this just young people, as in the Black Lives Matters protests in the summer in the UK and in the US in particular? Is it at least partly related to the pandemic, that there's a sense that that's creating some of the mass appeal? of these protests, people who need to get out. It's heightening emotions in different ways. The issue is undeniably important to many people, but will it have a long-term political effect? Can the women's movement turn itself into an actual political force? I don't know the answer to that. I think it's, how can we predict in the current time where everything is so uncertain where things are going to move? It would seem to me to be difficult, because this single issue is what unites a very large group of people. Over 70% of Polish voters in several polls said that they disagreed with the ruling of the court. And this is a mixture of religious people, of somewhat conservative people, of leftist people. Whereas if it starts to broaden itself to other issues that people might not agree on in the same way, it will be difficult, I think, to turn it into a political force in that way. It's a very interesting question, though. No one really knows what it's going to mean in a few years' time, how we will look back. Will we look at it as the beginning of the end for peace, that the women's strike started to bring peace down? I would say it's possible, but we don't know.
Yeah. And is poll exit a possibility?
It's what, sorry?
Poll exit.
Poll exit? I don't think so, because the vast majority of Poles don't want to see that happen. And PiS is Eurosceptic, but in the main, it's not. It's not a party that wants to take Poland out of the EU, though there are factions within PiS's coalition that are much stronger on that. And I would certainly say that once PiS ceases to be a net beneficiary of the budget, so once Poland ceases to be a net beneficiary of the European budget, a poll exit movement could begin in Poland. I think it would still have minority support, but it would be a bit bigger than it is now, where there's no will, and PiS knows that, and I would not expect them to move in that direction, at least not intentionally. Unintentionally is a different question.
So I'm just picking another question.
Can I ask a quick question to Márta, actually? It's kind of following on similar, but maybe not quite extreme as that. Is Márta, I think you mentioned the economic woes of the Hungarian government, and there's a lot of growing discontent with their policies on health and other issues. But if the rule of law mechanism that the EU is currently proposing is actually agreed and implemented, and the budget goes through next week, which is by no means a certainty, I'm perfectly aware, but and that leads then to reduction in EU funding in Hungary, what effect do you think that will have on public opinion in Hungary? And might it trigger something, or might it actually trigger more support for the government?
That is certainly a very good question, and it's been hanging in the air for a number of years since the whole idea of funding conditionality has been in the discussion. What would cutting of EU funds mean in terms of the pro-EU sentiment that both in Hungary and Poland is so high? And the proposed mechanism does have an answer to this. The end beneficiaries, as they're called, the communities, the project citizens, they should not be losing out. They should not be the ones who are punished for corrupt government practices or government measures that hamper judicial independence. So in fact, the project should be going ahead, and governments who are facing budget cuts because of their wrongdoing would be obliged to still continue to implement these projects. It's just that the EU wouldn't be funding them, or the funding would be suspended. Now, there's also been a lot of advocacy from mayors, not only from Poland and Hungary, but certainly these mayors have been very prominent in calling for this, that the funds should not all be dispersed by the central government, particularly the Hungarian, so that there should be a mechanism which would allow municipalities to directly benefit from EU funds. And also, same way, funds that would go, for example, for democracy promotion should also be accessible for local groups, so that the benefit to the population would not be dented, but the measure should actually target the wrongdoing and the wrongdoers. but we have to see how this works out. And these days, I think the negotiations and the very, of course, high interest in making sure that there would be a budget and a COVID recovery fund, and member states would be able to benefit from that as fast as possible. These are also very important, and we'll see how values will be maintained. I think the European Parliament in this whole struggle for rule of law conditionality has been very principled, or at least most of it. And I hope that the German presidency will also preserve this political agreement. But we have to see how it works out. But at the same time, I think it's quite important to see that Hungarians are mostly pro-EU, and the government has always made sure that whenever this issue was discussed, that they would question whether there was any rule of law notion. So they try to, turn the whole discussion out from its corner, or that they would say that we're the true Europeans, right? This is the Ivan Krastov and Stephen Holmes have been talking about this, that we don't want to imitate others anymore. They should imitate us. We're the true guardians of Christian values, of white Christian Europe. Actually, that's what they should say. That would be the real thing. And so I think they really try to get out of this argument and to turn the popular sentiment not against Europe, but against the liberal values of Europe, the liberal democracy that the European Union, espouses, and that's what it's built on. And so we see how in the Hungarian Prime Minister's rhetoric in recent weeks, this has become there's been, of course, a lot of liberal bashing going on in Hungary for years, but now, words very colloquial to describe liberals have become a standard part of his dictionary. These ideas are being put out there, in people's minds and pushed through the propaganda media. So it's rather that the disillusionment with European Union accession is somehow in a very sort of banal way, exploited, and it's I don't think that there would be any, Mr. Orbán is pragmatic enough that he wants the money, and not for all Hungarians, but for only a few. So I think it's rather that that just a way. I don't want to go on too long about this, but certainly I think everybody gets the idea that it's Europe who's at fault and we're the righteous ones. And that's the narrative that is being pushed.
So there's someone's made a comment rather than a question. It seems that rewriting history in education, media, and newly created cultural sites is another avenue the Hungarian government is pursuing. And perhaps related to that a bit is racism and xenophobia were present in Hungary even before the Orbán regime. Is that the reason? Well, I'm sure it's not the reason, but could it be a reason why there isn't a strong enough opposition in Hungary?
Yeah, sadly, I certainly have to agree with the fact that racism and xenophobia have been present in Hungary well before Mr. Orbán came to power in 2015 or started using this as a sort of a tool, political weapon in 2015. Yes, the Hungarian population has been very hesitant and reluctant about the idea of having a lot of migrants, but I think that is not a real surprise. The part that is surprising to me and is painful is how reluctant it was even before 2015 to the idea that refugees should be provided a safe haven when there were so many Hungarians themselves who had left in 1956. And whenever we made the parallel, then it was very clearly spelled out that it was a completely different picture, and basically the same sort of racist arguments came back. That was the core of why this parallel was rejected. But it's not the only reason, I think, for for the weakness of the opposition, that they're racist themselves. Yes, a lot of opposition voters are clearly racist. When it comes to today, the popular sentiments about migration and refugees, of course, it's not only in the pro-government, among the pro-government voters, but also in with varying degrees among many other opposition political groups voters, that this sentiment is very strong. But it's also a question of the sort of the public confidence in the ability of these political movements or groups to actually craft policies that would stand, you know, whether there would be resources behind them. When people are seeing quite a lot of cash being rolled out by the government, also in Poland or in Hungary, in the form of family support subsidies, tax cuts or tax rebates, then they would want the same thing, of course, from any opposition party. But then the question comes, would the budget be there? Would the resources be available? And the economy, the policies of Mr. Orbán's government on the economy side have not been as nearly as unsuccessful as the ones on human rights or just, you know, general human decency. So I think yeah, that trust also would have to be earned with concrete proposals and also plans for securing the funds for that.
Okay, I think we're coming towards the Stanley, you're muted.
Can I make a quick point on the multiculturalism, which I think is a really interesting issue on the sort of racism and opposition to migration. And I think it's interesting to look at this from historical perspective, because if we look at Western Europe, multiculturalism was a fact before it became an ideology. Right? It was a fact that was essentially caused by labor market needs, by economic needs, and then people began to understand what the benefits of it were, and then eventually states started to actually develop sort of specific ideas and policies around multiculturalism. And this was a process that lasted quite a long time in societies that had become diverse, as simply a matter of fact. Whereas in Central and Eastern Europe, what's interesting, of course, is that we're looking at societies that until very recently have not been diverse at all. In fact, among the most homogeneous societies anywhere, particularly Poland, for instance. And therefore, people who simply don't have experience in their lives, in many cases, of people from other cultures and other places. And yet the feeling is that we need to borrow this sort of idea of multiculturalism from Western Europe and sort of promote it in Poland too, which is what the previous government, for instance, was doing in some ways and in certain sort of aspects, not necessarily of its policies, but of its rhetoric. And so it was very easy then for the Polish government, like the Hungarian government, with that level of sort of simply unfamiliarity and something that had not developed in any organic way as it had in the West, to sort of raise fears around this issue. But I would have to say that in the long term, I think I'm a little bit more optimistic about how this will move, because my view is that if we look at the situation of countries like Poland and Hungary with very, very low birth rates, with high levels of migration, the only way they're going to be able to keep the levels of economic growth that they've seen in recent years is by accepting migrants. And both the countries in different ways, particularly Poland, have been doing it. Poland's been accepting more migrants than anywhere else in the European Union, most of them so far from Ukraine and Belarus, but many also, more and more in fact, coming from places like Turkey, the Philippines, other parts of South Asia. And so I think Polish society is becoming more diverse, will continue to become more diverse. And I think that social views will definitely change on those questions over time as a result. But of course, it doesn't help when the message they're being fed by public media is all negative about migrants and people who come from other places, which is what we see in Poland now, which means in the short term, you've actually seen people become less tolerant in Poland. But I would be fairly optimistic that in the long term, Poland is and will be a more open place. And it's really changing. I mean, Warsaw is so much more diverse today than it was even 10 years ago. You're seeing really big changes. And I think that is going to be the trend over the coming years. And that will mean that Poles will have to rethink their identity in the way that in Britain people, or in Australia, people had to rethink their identity several decades ago and make that identity a more inclusive and wider one. I think we will see that in Poland. I'm not sure. I won't comment on Hungary.
Okay, so we're almost run out of time, and unfortunately we haven't had time to cover many questions in the list, but perhaps I could ask the speakers if they've spotted any other questions in the chat that they would like to quickly address before I hand back to Paul as chair for the evening.
Yeah, just one thought, and I see in the chat a lot of people talk about this, how Poland and in fact Hungary have been much, they had been diverse societies before the First or the Second World War. And it's very important to add, and of course this would open up a whole new several hour long discussion, but how this understanding and identity narrative is also a crucial element in this illiberal politics that we see, at least in Hungary, but I think in Poland too. So how people think not only about 1956 and have the Hungarian refugees, but even, the greater Hungary that a lot of people might be dreaming of, or it certainly is being fanned by many senior government officials also, would also include a lot of minorities. And somehow this is not part of this narrative. In fact, it's being, I think, increasingly written out of Hungarian history. So, of course, societies even today are much more diverse than what the official narrative would make us think. And I think a lot of people are very aware of this. Also, the demographic decline and the low birth rates, I mean, they are also very much related to the fact that a lot of Poles and a lot of Hungarians have left just in the past 10 or 20 or 30 years. And that, of course, also creates quite a lot of anxiety, I think, and certainly in Hungary, not only in the grandmothers who don't get to see their grandchildren every weekend, but also in terms of a decreasing number of people, and particularly in a smaller country like Hungary. It's not tiny, but it's smaller than Poland. I think this sentiment is stronger. What's going to happen to us? Where will we go? And so Mr. Orbán has a very clear answer to this, and he does repeat this very often, and that it's not through migration, but through, rearing and producing Hungarian children that this demographic issue should be addressed. It doesn't seem to be working, but certainly the narrative is becoming more aggressive, and I think it's making a lot of Hungarian women a lot more upset.
Great. Well, I think if that's it, I think that's. I'd like to thank Márta and Stanley for a really interesting discussion. I think we've ran way over our time, our planned time. I think that just reflects the level of interest and just how informative the discussion's been. It's been great, actually. And I think we'll all be watching the news a lot next week. I mean, I think the practical deadline for the Brexit post-Brexit trade talks between the UK and the EU is apparently the end of next week, but that's also the deadline for the EU to agree its own budget. So I think this on next Friday, I think maybe the Saturday, it's going to be very interesting to see if the EU Council and Parliament does actually hold the line on the rule of law and on the budget, and then we can see what impact that will have. And I think it's because of both events, I think it's going to be an extraordinarily potentially important week for the future of the EU. So keep an eye on things, but don't expect anything to happen before about Wednesday or Thursday. I think we know how these things work. So I think I'd like to thank our speakers again. I'd also like to thank Cahir and Michael for looking after the questions there so well, and also for all our audience for all the questions and all your discussions in the chats. It's been very good. You've all been very well behaved, and I think to see this discussion, level of discussion is very encouraging, I think. And I know that some of you have joined us from way beyond Cambridge, looking at some of the emails and you know, as far away as Oxford even, and even further Poland and Hungary. So it's been great to have you all with us tonight. I think we will have more events perhaps next year. I don't think we've got anything else scheduled for this year, but I think if you keep an eye on the Cambridge for Europe website and Facebook group, Facebook page, we'll be advertising more events there probably, hopefully quite soon. So I think this is where I normally have a round of applause, but I think just for both our speakers, for those of you who are visible, and I think thank you all and good evening.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thanks to everybody for attending.
Yes, thank you. It was a pleasure to be here. All the best. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.